Hello, friends, and welcome back to another episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast. I'm your host, as always, Patrick McFarlane, and on the line today, I have a writer at the Libertarian Institute. It is Kym Robinson. How's it going, Kym?
G'day, how you doing?
So this is your first time on the podcast, and so, of course, I always just ask everyone to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm very fortunate to be writing for the Institute now, and I do other writing like non-fiction stuff. And because I was a professional fighter, some time ago, I also do a bit of fitness, combat sports sort of fighting, and coaching people and all that sort of stuff. So, yeah, I suppose I'm very eclectic with the things that I do, and here we are.
Yeah, well, that's awesome. And like, how long have you been writing for the Institute?
I was lucky because Scott put up in 2017 when he started up the Institute with like Will Gregg and Sheldon, all those guys, and he just put something up on Twitter. And I was writing for liberty.me. I don't know if you remember that. There was like a libertarian sort of thing, and I put some stuff up on that, but I didn't like the format of that. So then I just submitted a heap of stuff that I'd written to Scott. And then, he said, dude, and I was lucky, just started putting up all my stuff, all my long-winded rants that I did. So I'm trying to get a little bit better at writing because now that you realize people are actually reading you. But yeah, so I've been very lucky that I've been writing since the very first days of the Institute, fortunately.
Yeah, well, so tell me, you and I both have kind of a shared background because you said you're a fiction writer, right?
Yes, yeah, that's right.
Okay. Yeah, so I was a creative writing focus as an English major in undergrad. So like, awesome. I don't write as much fiction as I would like to, but I can definitely tell. We're going to be talking about one of your pieces today, Medusian Liberty. And your prose is off the charts, man. I really like it. It's really good stuff.
Thank you.
But so let me ask you a little bit more though about, so where are you coming from? Like, how did you find liberty? And just tell me a little bit about like your intellectual journey.
That's a tough one. I think I joined the army as a teenager, so I was always down that path of there was that statist inclination. Like you think, I'm going to join the army, I'm going to be a good soldier, I'm going to defend freedoms, all that sort of stuff. But over time, you see through regulation, you see through all these other things that it's actually contrarian to liberty, and you realize that it's this big monolithic monopoly that has an influence and impact on every single thing that you do in your life. And so I sort of just reading certain things, watching movies, like all the movies and all the characters that I enjoyed were more mavericks, they were more individualist, and they were defying whether it's a corrupt local government, like Smokey and the Bandit or something like that, or Convoy, to a big government, whether it's the evil Nazis or the evil communists or whatever else, or even, a corrupt aspect of, the US government or something like that. There was always a consistent theme that like doing the right thing is sometimes standing in opposition to the mob, to the monopoly. And so I was very fortunate that I got into it that way through fiction, funnily enough. But I was also reading a lot of war books, which is probably why my anti-war passions became very apparent, because I was the kid that was reading the war books, watching the war movies, and making the army tanks and planes, but never actually thinking about the real impact. So you think, tanks are awesome, and and big bombers and that. But then you start, you're painting a model aeroplane, and then you think, all right, so they're dropping this on cities full of who, and it's like, it's almost like if I was as a child. Say an 8-year-old boy, for example, if I was, getting an axe and I was putting bits of blood and bits of sinew and bits of guts and all this sort of morbid stuff on it, people would be concerned. They'd be like, man, you just created like this is a bit concerning for a young kid to consistently do that. But when you're making model airplanes and tanks and stuff like that, the consequences is disassociated because it's on such a mechanized mass scale that you don't actually relate it to the victims. Whereas, if it's an axe that's killed 2 innocent people, it's like, oh, that's the worst thing in the world. Where if it's the Enola Gay that you've just made a model airplane of, that's just, dumped a massive piece of ordnance over a city full of people and instantly killed, tens of thousands of them, that's considered acceptable. And I always found that to be a little bit uncomfortable, especially when I started thinking things rationally. And then, when you grow up and you join the army and you realize it's not, as noble as it could be. And then, through university and then through all that sort of stuff, you sort of realize that it's just people are just doing their job and they don't actually give a flying monkey about the principles that you think they should. Like for example, most public servants are just more interested in their own pensions and their own jobs, and there's probably maybe 1 to 10% of them are actually idealistic and moral, and the rest of them is just about a job, and it's about continuing working that job, their pension, how much they get paid, and that's doesn't matter what country in the world you are. That's all it comes down to. Like, I mean, you can read about Anne Frank, for example, as an individual, as a human being. Most people have read her diaries. But if you take a step back and you stop thinking about the little girl that's in that diary, and you think about the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people that were participating to destroy her life, to destroy her family, from neighbors that are dobbing her in to bureaucrats that are just, writing bits and pieces on numbers down on the paper that's, to logistics drivers, to the police, the local police and the Nazi police and things like that. There are all these people that are cooperating and working with each other to destroy this little girl's life. And then the people that hid her from all of those people doing a good job, concerned citizens, the moralizing, the law-abiding types, the people that did that, they're the radicals. They're the outliers. They're the few. And, that picture of, oops, sorry about that. Did I mess up the audio?
No.
Yeah, sorry. Cool. The picture that of the man crossing his arm with all the people doing the Hitlerian salute and all that. Yeah. He's the person who hides the little girl. He's also the man that was, put in a labor camp and executed, most likely, I think it's correct. But most of those other people are concerned about their families, they're concerned about their pensions, they're concerned about their jobs, they're concerned about the very minor things. But when the torrents of history come washing through, they can look back if they survived the war and go, I was always against the war, but they participated in the effort to destroy liberty, to destroy human lives. And we see it now. We saw it during COVID, we see it during the drug war, we saw it in the war on terror, we see it consistently. And on and on and on. We see good people that don't agree. Like, you can talk to most cops, most soldiers, they completely disagree, and they become venerated. Like, they disagree with what they are doing and they're participating in, but the consistency is they still do it. You know what I mean? Because whistleblowers get punished. And here's an anecdote, I will say, for lack of defamation reasons, but there are some doctors that I may perhaps know of. And it's easier for them to give out false vaccination information so that you and I could say we've had the vaccine when we haven't, than it is for them to criticize the vaccine mandates. You know what I mean? So think about the lunacy of that. These people are supposedly practicing medicine, science, blah, blah, blah. There's no discourse, there's no conversation. Instead, if they are to say and criticize certain things because it's controversial, whether it's right or wrong, they can't criticize. That's a controversy, and that's a minor thing in the history of the world. That is the whole COVID thing is a very minor thing in the history of humanity, but right now it's a big thing. But for them to criticize, for them to call into question anything that's against the Australian Medical Association, the American equivalent, all these governing bodies, they can lose their licenses, they can lose their job, they can lose their profession. So it's easier for them to be a corrupt individual within that entity. And I think that happens everywhere. It might be a police officer that lets you off a ticket because you flash them your cleavage, or because you're their cousin or their brother, to, someone falsifying reports so that, they can do whatever that they need to do. That's how the entity works and it exists. But these people consistently participate in it because it's either easier to just go along with it, or to be that mythical person who's going to change it from within, which never happens, or they just are mercenaries. They don't have any morality, or they don't have any principles or dignity. They just don't care. They just do what they do. And I think that's the world that we live in, unfortunately, and it's an uncomfortable reality. And when you come to that realization, you sort of become an atheist, if that makes sense, like a political atheist, not a moral atheist, but you become moral, but you become an atheist when it comes to other people's morality, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah. This is because, a lot of people talk about how the left in the United States is a religion, or the state is a religion, or something like that.
Yeah. I think Larkin Rose, when his synopsis of statism is a religion, well, it is. It is a religion. Like, anything that's irrational and that's believed by more than a few people is a religion. Like, it doesn't matter where it's some pagan ritual, like doing some weird thing and, Alex Jones level of conspiracy of Bohemian Grove sort of stuff, to hundreds of millions of people worshiping the same God and getting down and, and sharing the Eucharist or whatever else. It's a religion. And when it becomes a theistic religion, it's the irrationality that a lot of people are sharing. And that is, it's insanity. And that's scary when you think about it.
Yeah. A couple comments on what you said. I've thought a lot of times about the COVID regime and that kind of stuff, and just kind of thought about just bearing witness to all of it and trying to remember all these little things about what happened and the feelings and what people said, and coming to this thought that, even people within libertarianism or our group like to think that they would be the guy not saluting Hitler, right? But most of them aren't, even in our ranks. And I'm not saying that I'm definitely the person who would abstain. I think that I've resisted pretty well throughout this whole COVID thing, and I've resisted throughout things. But like, no one knows until you're in the crucial moment, until you're actually faced with huge danger. And I think that, like, you said something else that really made me think, is that in COVID, the stakes for us were rather high. I mean, lose your job or take a shot or do something or lose your job. But in the grand scheme of history, that soft coercion is exactly that. It's soft coercion, and it's not the high stakes that many, many other people have faced throughout their life, throughout history, rather. Is that, either you comply or you stand against the wall, or either you comply or your family's disappeared, or something like that. And so it's just interesting to think about those things.
Well, and also if you contrast, like during the peak of the COVID panic, I think it was in Nigeria, I can't remember, but there was a number. There's so many police officers. Sorry, there's so many people that were murdered by the cops because they were defying the curfews. So the state had imposed these rules: you can't leave your house because, and then people are leaving to get food and water for their families, and they're just being gunned down.
Yeah,
and it's all over the world that was happening. In China we see, like, where people are being welded into the buildings, and they're extreme examples. But then at the same time, like, we would have completely arbitrary rules where, like here in Australia, for example, like, you come from one state and you cross the border and you came over, you have to be in isolation for 2 weeks. Then a police officer will come to your house, unmasked or whatever, shake your hand, say, where you been, mate, blah, 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 and walk off. And most people go, oh, it's good reasons and all that sort of stuff. It's insane. If people were really concerned about a virus, they wouldn't come up with these stupid rules. But these stupid rules, most people can agree, the police officer, the average person, they can agree that they're stupid rules, because the virus doesn't respect the regulations. It doesn't, the meme of when you're sitting down and eating, you can't get COVID, for example. It's insane. It's just insane, like, that people go to those levels. But that's indicative of nearly everything that the monopoly of, the government does. Like, there's always exemptions and exceptions. Like, you're an industry, for example, you can buy your credits to not pollute the environment if you're a big enough company. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. It's like, it's stupid. Or you can do certain things, like, or for example, certain American, British, Australian, French aircraft can drop a bomb over a city full of people and kill them, but they were, not intentionally doing it. Their intentions were good. That was collateral damage, and so on and so forth. But then if some fiend walks into a kindergarten and stabs a child, everyone's outraged. Everyone's admonished. Oh, no, that's just disgusting. There's a greater narrative. It's insane. And that's the exemptions that people allow themselves. They always give themselves these contexts. And if you sit down and have a conversation, most people agree with you, but then they participate in it anyway, because they always go, oh, there's always a good reason for it. There's always this and that. And when you sit back and you try not to be part of that, the mob, you're part of the mob's morality, where it's okay to, go along with enforcing rules that don't make sense or that aren't really for health concerns, or, celebrating in the mass murder of innocent civilians and or taxing someone because of whatever reasons. It's just absurd. But most people don't think about it that way, because they've got a neck in the game, because they've got a pension, because they get paid good money, they don't want to lose their job and things like that. Well, that's exactly why those people were saluting Hitler. I think to use the Hitlerian example is perfect, because it's so overdone and everyone's a Nazi and everyone uses the term, so you might as well just embrace it. They are those people that Nazi regime only existed not because Hitler was a magician that put all these magical powers over the universe. It's because people got something out of the regime, because people made money, because people had jobs, they shared in the ideology of it all, but they were not strong enough, they were not brave enough, and they were not principled enough to say, no, fuck this. Sorry, allowed to swear?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, sorry. Sod this, man. But and say no more. And those people that do that, they're, like I put in that article, the Medusian Liberty, they're the ones that are just the little weeds that are just popping up through the cracks of the pavement of civilized society. They're the ones that are in the shadows. They're doing all these little things. They're the ones, the guy that sells your weeds or mushrooms, you know, they're the ones that are selling you things in the grey market. They're the ones that are doing all that sort of stuff because they don't believe in the political process, because they know the political process always leads to more government. It doesn't matter if you vote, you know, red or blue in America, or here conservative or socialist or whatever. It always leads to more government, just a different variation of it. Okay, so that's mute. That's a non-existent aspect of the world. But if you are living your life free and the government has less impact on your life, then slowly over time, more and more people can go, hey, you know what? That person has this opinion. I agree with them. There's a courage in that. There's a courage in numbers. But the trouble is, a lot of people don't want to actually be those people. Instead, they just want to be part of the mob that agrees quietly. I mean, how many people do you know that agree with you, but they don't want to say it? Mm-hmm. You know, like I can't remember. There was some actor that was talking about how Hollywood, like a lot of actors are actually more conservative than what the whole woke culture perpetuates, but they're too scared to say anything. You know what I mean? Like, that's insane. Like, it's insane. But that's the world we live in, unfortunately. It doesn't matter what it is, but that's it is what it is, unfortunately. And I think as individuals, we just need to be a little bit more brave and a little bit more honest, and just have conversations with people that are left and right. And you kind of reach the conclusion that most people just want to be left alone and may not agree with what you do in your private life, but they don't want to change that. But they do other things that you may not agree with in their private life, and they want to change it because that's what a community is. But it's just like maybe 1 to 10% of people that are very imperial with their instincts and their ambitions, that want to cultivate the fear and kind of create a, you know, the term you used earlier before on this, the moral panic. They want to create that energy, and then all of a sudden you can't even be the person that says, hey, hang on, what's going on here? Because you become a defender of something that's so absurd that you were never defending in the first place. And that infects every group, you know, libertarians, communists, you know, like tankies versus Trotskyites or whatever, you know, they've all got discourse among themselves. And I think I think it's healthy to have discourse, but at the same time, not to be part of the mob.
Yeah, well, and part of this whole moral panic idea was just that, and why you have to be careful is because everything is so driven off of emotion when you're in a moral panic. And it's easy to because I mean it's driven by in what I think to present this whole idea, right? I have to be so careful because and I was a victim of this earlier because I made a COVID reference to you and I said that, you know, most people aren't losing their lives, they're just losing their jobs. Well, I'm thinking in such an America-centric view. And that was true in America, but like you said, it wasn't true in places like Africa or, you know, other parts of the world. But so when I'm thinking about moral panic, and the reason why I'm bringing this up is because you and I had a discussion in DMs talking about this idea of, you know, transgenderism being taught in classrooms in the United States. And again, you're saying that part of the whole swing to the populist right in the United States and in libertarianism in general is just that we're all so focused on what's happening in the United States that we just ignore everything else, or we don't even think about it.
Yeah, exactly. And every election is the most important election in human history.
Right.
Like every American election, it's the most important. We've got to get this one. You know, every single one. So what happens is there's a compromise. So American libertarians, generally speaking, and even some Canadians and others, because the money from what I can tell comes from the United States. So if I wanted to make money and I became a libertarian podcaster or whatever else, I'd talk about American partisan politics. I'd get caught up in the culture war. I would, you know, every SJW is a meme, is a caricature of what they really are. Every right-wing person is either a neocon or a DeSantis, you know, sort of thing. Like there's no nuance of it all. And what happens is every election, it builds up to the elections. Like, you know, we've got to be grassroots about it. We've got to get this person elected. We've got to get that person elected, and so on and so forth. And then at the end of it, you end up with Ronald Reagan. You end up with George W. Bush. You end up with compromise. You end up with lies and deception, and you just end up with more government. And the thing that really gets me, that's really absurd about it, is most people know this because they believe the 5D chess. They believe, I mean, you look at Donald Trump's campaign, that should have been completely indicative. He romanced and seduced so many libertarians. in America. Like he was on Alex Jones, so he got all the conspiracy things because he was going to drain the swamp, whatever, and he was playing to those things. And then he had Roger Stone and all these guys. He's a pragmatic libertarian, let's say, who's still part of that conspiracy theory. But then he would make reference to things. He even got some of the anti-war people seduced because he mentioned WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. You know what he did? He was a politician. You know what I mean? He did politician things, right? And they do that. That was just because that was from within our community that we noticed it. But he did that to every other group. Like, you know, that's what they do. That's how they get elected. They cover all their bases. They're seductive. And because, you know, he's a TV personality that's gruff and he says things like, you know, grab her by the pussy and stuff like that. The locker room guys go, oh, he's just like one of us, eh? No, he's not. He's a billionaire that's, you know, who wants to be in government, you know?
Yeah.
Like, no person who wants to get elected and wants to rule over other human beings is like anyone, I should hope, in the liberty movement. Because, I mean, Ron Paul's election, Ron Paul in his heart of hearts probably knew that he was never going to get elected, but he raised conversation. So it's in many ways. So the difference between a Ron Paul and a Donald Trump is a lack of compromise. You know what I mean? Like, so Donald Trump is all about compromise, and whoever runs next, heck, the most libertarian person that American politics could run might be a Tulsi Gabbard, for example. You know, like, you know, she might start swinging over and start talking about different things, and she's going to come from a left-wing perspective, but she's probably going to say things that's going to seduce the anti-war people. They're going to ignore some of the other things she said in the past, but they're going to be seduced by that, and it's going to be the most important election in history. And what do you end up with? You end up with Joe Biden, who makes George Bush in his Junior Bush in his prime years come across as being the most incredible, you know, non-weekend at Bernie's type of president in human history.
Right.
And it's the same thing here in Australia. We've got two dudes that no human being, like, realistically would want them to have them over for a barbecue. I mean, the most boring individuals ever. They're like bureaucratic heads. They're, you know, the boss is coming from the Department of Human Redundancy. And that's who these people are. And the Australians are electing them because one's not the other. So it's what one represents the Labor Party, one represents the Liberal Party. That's the reason why they get elected. They manage to ascend the ranks. And in the United States, out of 300 plus million human beings, Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, George Bush, Joe Biden, they were the best.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's absurd. It's absurd. It is absurd. And the rest of the world was sitting by watching and going, okay, who's going to be ruling the free world, and who's going to be leading the coalition of the willing in the next war that we have to go after, you know? And that's what it comes down to. It's so silly. And then the worst part about it is every libertarian podcast, all they want to talk about is something that's happening in a Florida school, you know? Because some guy that dresses up in drag wanted to teach little girls and little boys about, you know, transgenderism. And it becomes a big hot topic issue. But the fact that public schools exist should be the issue. You know what I mean? It's like, say, with the immigration issue. Americans have a big thing about that. And here in Australia, like, nationalists have that. They always use welfare as the issue why they need to curb refugees. Mm-hmm. Well, then the issue is welfare. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's not these refugees' fault. Like, these people that are crossing the line. There are so many jobs, I'm sure it's the same in the United States. There are so many jobs here in Australia, for example, that could not be done without people coming from overseas that do these jobs. But instead, it's always the welfare behemoth that is blamed, that is always cited, that is always cited as to why not to allow other human beings to pollute the purity of our society. And then the problem is welfare. If some guy dressing up in drag that wants to teach gender pronouns to children, well, then the problem is the institution that has created this situation in the first place. And that will be no different, as we discussed before, if earlier before this, if, you know, they want to talk about warfare. They want to talk about, you know, they go to a group of kids, they have some soldiers coming in trying to recruit, you know, boys and girls to go fight in another war. Go lie to them. Hey, you get citizenship. You're going to go to these trades. You're going to have all these skills. If you go to Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, you know, Pakistan, wherever, you've got to go to this other country to invade. That's just as problematic as teaching this other stuff. The problem is school. The problem is having an entity that decides what human morality is, that decides what you can and can't do with your children, and then does it under the guise of protecting these children. But in the same breath, it'll have no problem with creating a protective entity like the Child Protection Agency, which destroys families and which does have abuse problems itself. And then, oh, by the way, we also just blew up 17 kids in Yemen. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's absurd. It's absurd.
So what do you think about this? The prevailing counter narrative to that, and I'm sure you've heard it, is that, well, as long as public schools exist, because they do exist, we can't just go up and be like, well, the problem is that they exist, because they do exist and they're going to exist.
Well, that's the same thing. That's the pragmatism, and that's what comes back down to talking about the man with his arms crossed. It's the pragmatists that are the ones that are saluting Hitler. Like, well, he's who we've got now, so we have to work with him, and then hopefully, we can try to make him do what he wants to do and his regime do what he wants to do. The voting process and all these institutions and people's, donating to their politicians and all it essentially does is it enables and it validates the entity itself. That's all it does. So what happens is, like, say, even with the Hoppian argument that you've got to have a regent, like a monarch that's going to come around, it's going to be a philosopher king like King Arthur, like no king in history has ever been like. But, let's pretend in our magical brains of libertarian praxeology that, we're going to have this dictator of morality and libertarianism. What happens when he dies? You get a Marcus Aurelius to a Commodus. That's what you get. Oh, but we created a situation which is completely dependent on the philosopher king. Well, the opposite to the philosopher king can also happen too, and does happen. And it's the same thing with liberal democracy, or whether it's a parliament or a Senate Congress. It always ends up with the same: more government, more taxation, because people need to be regulated, apparently. More wars, at least in the Anglo, Franco, and American traditions. Switzerland does this addiction, but the United States, Australia, and America does this addiction. So when you think about it, law and regulation is just neurotic impulses of people. It's like, we've got to stop, schools from doing this because they may teach our children to become trans. Well, that's not all schools, that's not all teachers, but the neurotic belief and the fear-mongering is that we've got to do this. We've got to stop people from taking marijuana because they may suddenly want to go out and rape. Meanwhile, you're actually sexually molesting children to see if they're holding marijuana on their person. It's all neurotic impulses. We've got to go fight preemptive wars because the terrorists might come here and blow us up. So we have to kill as many people over there. We've got to. It's the neurotic impulse is the imperialist impulse, which is domestic and when it comes to foreign policy, and that's what it all comes down to. So that the pragmatic argument is that we have to work within the school structure, and we've got to stop these trans people from teaching, kids or whatever, this and that. Well, 30, 40 years ago, rock and roll was the devil's music. Had the satanic panic in the United States especially. You had all these people saying that comic books and rap music and all this stuff was the most horrible thing that a child could ever come across. It's no different. I disagree with, people talking to young children about sex is absurd, especially outside of the family unit. But once again, it comes down to school, because the school system can be changed according to whatever ideology or morality of the day decides is important, whether it's a pro-war stance, whether it's a pro-debaucherous stance for children, whether it's all drugs are bad, all music is bad. It doesn't matter. You could be the town of Footloose, right? And then you can swing and you begin the town of Greece, all based on the fact that you have an entity that has complete control and power over individuals' lives and the teaching of children what they can and cannot do, what they can and cannot learn. That to me is the problem. And I know that that's utopian, but isn't libertarianism and anarchism utopian in the first place? Why do we always have to compromise? Why should we compromise liberty all the time? What I mean? That's so silly.
Yeah, well, I mean, it comes down to being a radical. I mean, we're all radicals. That's what we are.
Well, and we understand the concept that decentralization is good, right? So in America, there's a fetish for nullification, states' rights and things like that. Okay, great. So now you got to suffer beneath a governor, all right? So then how far down the line can you nullify it? Can you as an individual nullify yourself? That's perfect decentralization. Perfect decentralization is individuals coming together in a cooperative, in a voluntary means, and they form in these groups, and they form these interactions, and they're exchanging ideas and goods and services and all that. That should be the libertarian dream. There are going to be bad players and bad actors, but from my experience, bad actors and bad players flourish and they thrive under laws. They become corrupt. The drug cartels only exist because of drug prohibitions. They get jobs in government. They get jobs in big corporations and things like that. They do horrible things and they're protected by it. So decentralization should be the perfect goal and ambition, but instead it's always, I hate Disney because it's got a different ideology to me. So I'm going to support another massive corporation that has a similar ideology to me, but I'll ignore certain compromises because those compromises don't offend me, but they're going to offend other people. You know what I mean? So it's always the same. It's always the same answer. It's always left versus right, whatever left-right distinctions are. And I think that's so antithesis of liberty. I think liberty is about individuals' interpretations and cooperation and volunteerism. Well, that should be the key tenets, you know, cooperation, volunteerism, boom. And you go, all right, cool. I have to send my kids to school. All right, well, let's have a conversation about that. I mean, isn't America supposed to be this free country, and it's supposed to be based in this Constitution, this Bill of Rights, that the rest of the world is constantly told that we're crap because we don't have? Well, let's see it in practice. You know, let's see it actually in practice, as opposed to compromise, amendments. You know, it's daft. It's so daft.
Well, I think that's a great kind of transition into your article, because, you know, one of the big reasons why I wanted to talk to you again is because right now there's this big thing going on. People in the United States worried about teachers, you know, teaching sex to kids in public schools. And like, and to be clear, and you said this, but it bears repeating. Like, yes, that is a problem. Okay. But to go into something and get so emotional about it and get so reactionary about it, we just have to make sure that we are addressing what the real problem is and taking it that way, but also being introspective and taking a look at ourselves and making sure that we're not overreacting and that we're looking at things based on evidence and reason and things like that. But go ahead. Yeah.
No, you should. Sorry, you continue. Sorry.
Well, you wrote this piece called Medusian Liberty, where in another thing that I brought up, and I can't remember if I talked about this on the show or if it was when we were talking before we hit the record button, but this presumption that conservative values are more friendly to libertarian values, that if you're conservative, it's more like if you have a nuclear family unit and you have some kind of faith, Christianity or otherwise, some kind of moral code, that's more likely to produce libertarian individuals. Well, I think that is just an assumed conclusion, and I don't know exactly what the answer is, but I think that you present the counter arguments in this article that you wrote.
Well, I think what you're talking about just before with the trans teachers thing,
yeah,
I think that is not an evergreen subject. I think that's going to seem as absurd as the satanic panic was in the 1980s, as all these other panics when it comes to children. Like, for example, I'll use left and right in an American kind of context. Like, so say the left will go, all right, we have a gun problem. Okay, so we're going to ban guns. Whereas you and I will be like, well, no, it's not all people should be punished because some bad people did, you know, individuals and innocent human beings, and then giving the state who does that, like especially with how many dogs and individuals have been executed by American cops in the past years, that's a silly argument. So you can agree with that, right?
Yeah.
So then now creating a silly caricature that all trans and non-binary teachers are evil groomers of children creates a very dangerous, like that all Jews are the Hitlerian caricature, or that all gun owners are the same thing. So the left has a very big concern and a real concern that, you know, gun violence is because of gun ownership. And then the right has this concern that trans, probably 0.1% of teachers want to teach certain objectives and ideologies. Mm-hmm. So therefore it's transsexualism, it's sexual debaucherism that's the problem. And then we're going to go down to more, because pornography on the internet especially is under fire. Like there is more and more censorship going on with that. So we're already seeing a right-wing conservatism influencing sexual topics based on what is right and what is wrong. Okay, so that is as evergreen as what it would be if it was 1985, because some kindergarten teacher had a Playboy magazine and apparently he was doing satanic rituals or whatever the whole thing was that. And that spread on. And that's what I think is happening right now in these schools and with the Florida law. It's a reaction to a meme. It's reaction to character. It does exist. I'm not denying that. But it's probably not as widespread as what people think. And then it's poorly timed with the whole Disney thing. But I think before the record button is no one has a problem when there's sexual grooming and rape in the church, in the military, from the police, from bigger things. It's always individuals that are responsible. It's not the entity. But then now that Disney, because Disney has an SJW narrative, it is all of Disney. It is some conniving, manipulative Disney agenda, as opposed to some horrible human beings that are doing these things. And that, I think, is the problem. So, like, do we completely destroy the life of every member of Disney and all the hard work that they've done because there is a group of individuals from within that organization that are responsible? Or do we do what conservatives generally do? Say, a couple of priests are responsible for raping young boys within the Catholic Church. It's not all Catholic priests. You know what I mean? Like, is it guilt by association?
Right.
Is it guilt by organization? Like, it's got to go both ways. But the trouble is, the left and the right and people that are into politics, they are the biggest hypocrites. Like, when you and I argue online with people, we kind of like having a logical argument. We try to stay away from hypocrisy. We try to be consistent. Most people, and this comes back to that religion conversation we were talking about earlier, where most people's beliefs are religious, that hypocrisy doesn't matter. They just believe. So the gun argument to the right or the left, either one could be hypocritical. It doesn't matter because they believe, and so long as they believe, they're right. And that is the absurdity of it all. And that's why individualism is so sacred, because if you let the mob or a centralized organization have that much power, and the morality of the mob and the centralized organization have that much power, it's going to crush a lot of individuals that have done no wrong whatsoever. And back to the Medusian thing as a counterpoint. Okay, Mozart, for example, right? You've listened to Mozart,
yeah,
right? Okay, so you'd consider that very safe, conservative type music. Like, you're pretty, classical music, right? You could put that on at church, right? You could put that on. Have you read any of the letters he wrote to his cousin?
I have not, but I know where you're going with this.
You read some of the debaucherous things that genius mind wrote, right? The literal toilet humor and the gross things that he came up with, right? He was very libertine of his time. But over time, he became accepted. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Now you could watch Twisted Sister, and you could listen to a lot of these musicians from that era when the right wing, the Reagan conservatives were against them and all that. They become accepted. The Simpsons, for example, was apparently anti-family. Like that the Bushes were a little bit up about it. Then the Bushes appeared on it because it becomes such a powerful cultural phenomenon that actually did turn out having certain family values, that it was accepted. Now, when it comes to sex and transgenderism, debauchery, if you will, homosexuality and that, the conservative movement has some really interesting characters in it. You had Milo Yiannopoulos, for example, who was a very contentious contrarian, who was a gay man, former Jewish gay man, if I remember correctly, became a Catholic, and he married a black man, and now I think he's straight again, and then he's Jewish again or something like that. I don't know. But my point being is he was a person who was saying a lot of things that a lot of pro-Trump conservatives were celebrating because he was contrarian, because he was against that. What they were able to, in their minds, allow him the rights of all these different identity aspects that he shared out there. Blair White, for example, a very powerful conservative voice. She's a trans woman, okay? Now, most trans people probably share her values and listen to her. She is not necessarily an outlier, but she is an individual that you can talk to. In Australia, on Sky News, which is like a Fox affiliate, we have a former soldier. I can't remember her name. They're a trans person. They're a transsexual lady now. They are one of the most ardent right-wing nationalists you'll ever hear. There's probably not a war that she does not celebrate. She's a trans woman, okay? She's a different individual to other trans people. But what happens is when you go down the whole human beings have to be binaries, that only a married man, like Joseph Stalin was a married man, that has children in an atomic family setup, have the rights to morality. Well, let's look at domestic violence between married couples. Let's look at abuse and all that sort of stuff. Only these people are the moral vanguard of libertarianism. It's absurd. But the other thing that is really fascinating is if you read a lot of the writings of people that were very libertarian back in the day, most of these people, abolitionists or individuals that were very radical, etc., were people that celebrated in their pornographic lifestyles, or they might have been sex workers. They might have been women on the frontiers of the Wild West who were madams or who were sex workers, because that was pretty much the work they do. They lived debaucherous lives and they did debaucherous things, but they didn't coerce other people. So why is a sex worker considered a worse human being than a police officer?
Mm-hmm.
Because a sex worker, generally speaking, can discriminate. She satisfies customer demand because the customers come to her or him or them. The customers come to them. A police officer goes to people that don't want them in their lives, will impose a law that they don't necessarily believe in. They will enforce this law that they don't believe in. They act as a mercenary for the state, and conservatives will celebrate that. And that it's going to be police officers and not sex workers that's going to take their guns, that's going to go after them and force them to pay more taxes. But for some reason, because people have a Judeo-Christian perspective on the world of they read too much Leviticus and they don't read enough, Romans perhaps, and they get caught up on scripture, and they are so Old Testament God when it suits them, but then they're quite happy to let other things go. So when it comes to homosexuality, when it comes to premarital sex, when it comes to people doing those things, they're obsessed with it. They're like obsessed with it to a point of discomfort. Like, I don't think there's too many gay people out there that are obsessed with straight people, as straight people seem to be obsessed about gay people. And what's going to happen, and this is what we discussed before the recording, what is going to happen when some of these sacred cows within the liberty/conservative, the Paleo libertarians or whatever they're called, the definition is, comes out as bisexual or has had certain sexual experiences, or they get doxxed, like someone goes through their internet history, or because we're in a world where the more famous you become, you're going to get hacked, right? Let's say your podcast becomes super big, it goes down the Joe Rogan path and, Scott's show, for example, and they're going to come under attack. And then in 2010, you looked up, Sailor Moon images or whatever else, and that comes back and haunts you. And then you have to defend yourself, or even worse, some smart person puts it on your system. There's no one has been harmed. It's a drawing or whatever. No one's been harmed. It's completely, you've done nothing wrong, all right? You've not raped anyone. You've not coerced anyone. But you're going to be admonished more than a returned soldier who's probably killed innocent civilians who's seen the light ever will be. And I find that absurd. And we will listen to soldiers, we will listen to police officers who come to they'll agree with us and say, look, man, I totally agree, I was wrong. And they get to be a born again Christian status, they get to be born again, essentially morally cleansed because they've seen the way. But someone who was a sex worker or someone who did something debaucherous, not rape, but actual voluntarily, is considered tainted and tarnished. And I think that is absurd, especially considering that was between two volunteering individuals, which we should celebrate as liberty-minded people. But those who do the actual coercing, whether through job or whatever else, we kind of give a pass to. And, it's just a conversation that we sometimes avoid. And I think that's something that I think is really important. And I'll let you jump in because I was going to add something as well towards when, but just in case I went on too much of a rant.
No. Well, I have to admit, this is going to be it's going to be a hard thing for a lot of people who listen to my show, I think, to hear this.
Can I say one thing? Sorry.
Yeah.
It's because Americans are very Puritan still.
Yeah.
Americans are this is a stereotype, sorry, America. Americans are more concerned about someone's boobies and bum crack than they are about images of blown up children. You know what I mean? Like, there is a really Puritan instinct in the United States compared to, say, French culture. And even here in Australia has both. We are very Puritan in some aspects. Like, even though you can be a secular country and people can be outwardly atheist and completely talk about this, even atheists have a certain absurdity when it comes to Puritanism. And Puritanism is one of those things that changes over time, like I was talking about with Mozart, for example. And that sort of conservative values can change over time. Like, we are probably in our lifetime going to see outwardly gay priests within some, we already are.
Yeah.
And that's going to be accepted. It's going to be more and more accepted. And that's the sign that it's not right or wrong. It's just a sign of the times. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's just how things are. But it's because I think Americans, generally speaking, are obsessed with Christianity. It's ingrained. It's in God we trust, Mm-hmm. It is ingrained in American culture.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the portion of the show where I tell you how you can help support this content. The Libertarian Institute fundraiser has successfully concluded with your help. So thank you to everyone who helped support the Institute. We really appreciate it. We were able to raise $62,000, well, $62.5 of our $60,000 goal. So we really appreciate that, and you help keep us going for a bit longer here. The other way that you can help support my content directly and get special access to what I do is libertyweekly.net/Substack. I've been running all my benefits through Substack lately, where you can get preprints of my articles before they publish. You get bonus episodes of the podcast. You also get early access to forthcoming episodes as they apply. So I told everyone that I'm looking to migrate my Substack to a platform that I actually own that has a lot more features than Substack does. Well, I'm working on a new book, and I'm not going to do that migration until the book comes out. So I'm working with Connor Freeman. We're going to put out a book about China. We're really excited about it, working hard on it, hoping to do that and get it out within the next couple months here. But I'm not going to do that migration until that happens. So if you want to get better access to what I'm doing and get updates on things like that project and some bonus episodes, behind the scenes stuff, head on over to libertyweekly.net/Substack. And if you go to libertyweekly.net/support or hit the side scroller button here at the head of the website, you can find a whole bunch of other ways to support me. Patreon supporters will be getting the same bonuses. But if you want to give a one-time gift, head on over to libertyweekly.net/support to do that. Also, you can help out the show. I've been getting a lot of traction lately, so keep it up. Share, subscribe, like, rate, review, do all those things. You should know by now how to boost your favorite podcast. So thanks, everybody. Really appreciate you listening, and we'll catch you next time. Oh, yeah, and also, guys, I'm so terrible at, telling everyone about guest appearances that I've made on other shows. I was recently on an episode with Kyle Matovic on In Liberty and Health, where I joined Angela McArdle, the future chair of the National Libertarian Party, to talk about the populist right and kind of the post-libertarian moment and share some thoughts on that. I know this episode specifically has to do with that, but I elaborated a lot more on what my thoughts are in relation to that and why I think it's important to offer a bit of a critique, even though I don't condemn those people. I wish them luck when it comes to what their strategies are, but I have to speak the truth as I see it and what I believe and be honest about it, and the concerns that I have with these kind of subjects. So go check that out. I'll put a link in the show notes page below at libertyweekly.net/213, and you can find the link to my appearance with Angela McArdle and Kyle Matovic. Yeah, this is a challenging conversation for me. For a few reasons. Because one, I don't talk about this a lot on the show, and two, I mean, I told you, I am a conservative, so it's, for me, I'm just trying to look at, especially your argument about the LGBTQ agenda being taught in public schools. It is very hard for me to even consider the fact that it's not something that's systematic or ingrained because to take a look at it rationally, and I think you make a compelling argument that, of course, not every teacher who is LGBTQ is going to be promoting all this stuff. And in fact, it's most likely a small percentage of those people. But we have all this anecdotal evidence from social media and libs of TikTok and all of these people at PTA meetings or at school board meetings coming in and talking about how their kids are being taught, all this stuff.
But it's okay for a straight teacher to have sexual relations with an underage child.
Right. No.
But you know what I mean? So therefore, that happens too. But obviously, someone's not going on TikTok and going, "Hey, I just banged an 8-year-old today. Oh my god, lols." Right. They're not doing that. They're, it gets found out, it's bad. But on TikTok, they're doing it because it enrages the right. Mm-hmm. Because it's getting your ire up. That's what it comes down to. And so what it does, it perpetuates things, and that is no different to what people from our community and the conservative community are doing as well. Mm-hmm. It's no different to a guy eating a steak sandwich or eating meat in front of a vegan. That's all it is. It's intentionally angering someone just because it's what people do. And I think that's what with social media. And if you step outside of social media, you probably wouldn't even know what's happening. But it's because it's a hot topic subject right now. Yeah. And I think that's the problem with it. And it's an American problem, but a lot of things, American, I can't remember what it is, but America spends so much money on their public schooling system, and it's shit. you know, and
Right, yeah.
like it's a horrible system, and it's terrible. It treats children like it just treats children as a job program. After I left the army, I went to uni to become a teacher, and it was here no different. It's all about a job. It doesn't matter if the kids learn anything. It doesn't matter what they learn. It's about, like a lot of teachers probably get into it for the right reasons, but over time they become apathetic employees. It's just a job, and you might reach and help some people. But I think as a coach, a fight coach, I have more impact on an individual level where I could have a lyceum of conversation in a gym with younger people than I could in a school setting. Because there's no way people learn, you can't sit down 30 kids to learn a curriculum that's cookie cutter in its whole concept, that's based on what a government entity has decided that individuals need to learn, based on the government entities need to, one, create jobs for teachers, and B, to perpetuate itself in the first place. So it doesn't matter if it's teaching trans children, teaching children to be trans, or if it's teaching children that, Christopher Columbus is the greatest human being in history, that America was built on these founding principles of, heroic liberty. Let's ignore slavery and let's ignore all the other history, or that Australia is based in, is a European implant in a very Asiatic region of the world, and we're just going to ignore white Australia policy. We're just going to ignore all the Aboriginals that were murdered. We're going to ignore all that history. We're going to literally whitewash it. That is what school does. Is it creates in a very important stage of an individual's life. It implants a seed of mistrust, of lies, which then generates mistrust, and then people learn myths that are passed as curriculum. Mm-hmm. I mean, he's left wing, but there's a guy that Professor Lowell, who did Lies My Teacher Taught Me. You ever heard him? Yeah, awesome stuff. Predominantly American stuff. Well, this conversation we're having about the trans thing, this goes back, bum, 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 bum. Mm-hmm. You can read a Howard Zinn book, and he wants to talk about the genocide that's occurred against the Native Americans. That's pretty important. Yeah. All this history is pretty important. The Mexican-American War is pretty important. The American war against the Philippines and the Cubans, pretty important, because you can see a lot of the tenets and a lot of the imperial inclinations under that era of presidency and rule American leadership to what we have today in the United States. That's important to learn that. And if you read that and you learn that and you learn about the victims, that might change people's minds at a young age. But no, we're not going to talk about that, because on TikTok, some trans dude in pink Sailor Moon outfit is telling some kids, probably didn't even happen, some of these things. Some of these, I think, are pretty much done to inflame the right. Because there are other teachers that are probably going to disagree with this, because a lot of teachers do love kids. Doesn't mean they want to have sex with kids. They do love kids, and they do want what's best for kids. And they're going to see a guy or a girl or a trans person, whatever, coming in and wants to talk to 4 to 8-year-olds about sex. And that's going to get them upset too, because most teachers, even if the teacher is a hardcore Marxist-Leninist, still has instincts to protect.
Right.
So what happens is we create a caricature, you know what I mean? And I think that's what happens. And right now, I'm sure in 5 years' time, maybe 2 years' time, this conversation and what we're talking about right now is going to be completely redundant. It's going to be as redundant as banning comic books, or policing comic books, or South Park, It's going to be as redundant as that in many aspects. And I think that's the problem. We're so caught up in that. But at the same time, those trans people and those LGBTQ peoples that are doing that, that's not all of them. Like you and I, we aren't Ted Bundy.
Right, yeah.
We aren't, that's not us. Just because we like, females, doesn't mean that we are going to eat them and sex and rape them like he did. That he's an extreme example of heterosexual sexuality. But for some reason, you and I don't have to justify that. We don't have to rationalize. We can understand that's a horrible human being doing horrible things. Now, why is it for any other group, it's not the same? Why is it that every Muslim became bin Laden, or a hijacker? Mm-hmm. That's the trouble. And I think that is a collective mindset that even infects the liberty movement, and it's probably to do with our upbringing, our nationalistic inclinations, our socio-economic blah, blah, blahs, whatever's pseudo-sociological crap we can put into it. But that's our own bias. That's our own perspective. And with the Medusian Liberty, I kind of wanted to come at it from a female perspective, because I think within the liberty movement, there is a massive deficit when it comes to female voices and feminism, because feminism isn't the opposite to masculinity. But for some reason, we are seeing it as the opposite of masculinity. If a woman, like say, covering the Medusian piece, wants to live in a van, wants to work on her own, wants to be left alone, instead of going after her and attacking her and trying to force her to justify and rationalize herself, maybe we should look in the mirror a little bit more, you know? Maybe we should look to our friends a little bit more. Well, look, you know, we've all got that dude that's done horrible things to chick and brags about it, you know, that we've all got those crass guys, and think, all right, over time, what if he did that to my sister, to my friend? And I found within the Medusian thing, and the reason why I use Medusa is we get taught, generally speaking, a masculine perspective of Greek mythology, that she's this evil monster that needs to be killed because, you know, she's the gods, you know, a god gave her this curse. But why? She was raped in a temple. She was raped by a male god in the temple because she was beautiful. And then, so every man that went after her would turn to stone. So don't go after her. Leave her alone. She lived in a cave, you know, let her be. But for some reason, there is an imperial instinct to go and conquer and to destroy. And this instinct is not just masculine or feminine. It's statism, it's collectivism. But why can't she be left alone? Like, why is it that if a woman wants to live in a van and travel the country for a period of time, she doesn't want to get married, she doesn't want to have a family, she doesn't need a man, she doesn't need to have children, why is that considered wrong? Why is it considered bad? So, you know, like, I wrote another short story after that. I put it up on my page, Half Cage. It's called The Fisherman's Daughter, because I had a conversation with this old lady. She's 85, and she wanted to be a fisherman or a fisherwoman. But when she grew up, in the part of England she grew up in, women weren't allowed on the boat because it was considered bad luck. And all she ever wanted to do was to go out to sea with her dad for 2 to 3 weeks when he went out to sea. But he was never allowed to. All her brothers could go out. All she ever wanted to do. So she stayed with her mum. Her mum's job was to cook, clean, and have children. Her mum was unhappy. She knew her mum was unhappy. So what did she end up doing? Cook, clean, have children. That's the traditional. Some women want that, not all. But that's what happens when culture becomes regimented, when it becomes determined, when it becomes, you know, imposed. And now, and she said this really interesting thing, now people can go as tourists, families can go on tourists on these fishing boats. When she was a little girl, she couldn't go out with her own dad to see what he was doing. That's all she ever wanted. And then she was talking, that's all I'm a stranger, I'm sitting down waiting to see some mates. And she comes down, sits down, and she tells me a life story, and she's full of regrets. As an 85-year-old woman, full of regrets. And then she's told by her own children that she's got to stay at home, watch television, because she might hurt herself. Well, you know what? There's an instinct. There's an instinct inside of her to be an individual, and she just didn't have the courage to do it because social conformity and all this. And there are lots and lots of women all through history that are the same thing. And I'm not going to talk about feminism in a fifth wave, 10th wave sort of thing, but feminism, when it first emerged, was, you know, almost like abolitionism, in the sense that women should not be raped and bashed just because it's by their husband. You know, that's pretty messed up, you know?
Yeah.
That's what it came about, you know? They aren't beholden to a man. You know, like, they are not that just because of, you know, social conservative values. And a lot of cultures in this world, like in Korea, for example, China and places like that, they still impose these values on people. In India and certain castes of India, it's very hard. So we're supposed to be this liberal democracy in the West, and we're still having a culture war over male and female. It's stupid. It's so dumb. It's like, you and I as men, if we walk past a Baldyke and she's wearing a flannelette shirt and she's got like a Megadeth t-shirt on and she's got a short haircut, we're like, hey, how you going? Like, you know, that's awesome, because we recognize, you know, she looks like a cool dude, you know. But her decision to not want to have sex with you or I, or not to marry you and I, isn't a slight or an insult. It's no more discriminatory than not being attracted to someone because of their looks, because of their habits, if they're a smoker or a drinker, if you don't like that, or because of their taste. We have the right as individuals to discriminate. So do they. You know, and just because, you know, you and I aren't going to become incel chads and meme about it, meme about how women deserve to be, you know, our waifus, because some woman with pink hair decides that she doesn't find us attractive. Or, to be honest, most of the girls that I have come across, and they're more young, in very good shape, very independent-minded, had done the marriage thing, had done the serious relationship, realized that it wasn't for them, observed it. This is the key. This is the very final important key. They've seen the unhappiness that other people who are in these relationships have. And they thought, this is not for me. It's not so much what they experienced, it's what they've observed. And that doesn't mean that they're wrong. It doesn't mean that the other people are wrong. It just means that they should be allowed to. So this whole narrative within the liberty movement at the moment that all men and women should be together and married and have kids is so, I'm going to use Hitler again. That's what the Nazis wanted. You know, that's what the Soviets wanted. They would breed, have more kids, stay at home, you know, boom. Like, why? To what end? Like, not for everyone. Like, you know, and if someone wants to have frivolous sexual interactions, that is for them to decide. That is for them to suffer the consequences and to enjoy the pleasures of that. And that's how it is. That's the world how it is. Like, but for some reason, I'm finding at the moment within the liberty movement, the 2020s liberty movement, there is a Puritan traditional aspect, and it seems to be coming from people that have read Hopper. At least they've read some memes by him and not his whole texts. And they seem to think that this is how things should be. And it's definitely an American thing, I think. Like, it's very much American. And it's marginalizing. It's making these women and these gay men and these trans women and whatever, they are allies. Because if anyone hates the status quo more than us, it's them. If anyone hates collectivism more than us, it's them. If anyone hates being told what to do, it's them. And I think they're our allies. And when it comes to anti-war issues and taxation, oh man, like, you're not going to tell some woman that wants to live in a van and not pay income tax and completely support her and fund her own expeditions on her own, you know, that she, you know, she's not going to read Rothbard. She's not going to read Mises. They don't need to. There are people who find these sorts of things outside of reading this sort of stuff. Maybe we should be listening to them, you know, instead of always reading the same texts. Like, oh yeah, I've got to read Hayek. I've got to read, you know, Rothbard. I've got to read Mises. I've got to read all these guys. Well, there are lots of intelligent, smart minds out there that are not writing a 500,000-page thesis on praxeology or libertarianism. You know what they're doing? They're doing it. They're selling at the farmer's market. They're working cash hand jobs. They're not on welfare. They're not working for the man. They're not beholden to a wage. They're living it. Maybe we should ask them what they're doing or how they're doing it. But you know what? They're scared to be out there because they constantly get attacked. They get attacked by the same Reddit meme-tards or 4chaners that don't necessarily believe in what we believe in, but they just believe in attacking. They believe in, you know, whatever it is. And so what happens is we get less and less female voices. And to me, that's scary. And that's part of the gist of the Medusian Liberty thing.
Yeah. I think it's a lot of it is just there's this. Hold on, I'm getting an echo.
Is it? How's that?
That's good. Yeah, sorry. There's I'm trying to figure out how to articulate this.
That's cool.
I think that people are against and reacting against people like you just described because they see those people as driving the war against them in terms of embracing the state and taking this progressive ideology of, you know, transgenderism or social justice and weaponizing it against them. And in
2022.
Right.
But not in 1992, not in 1982, not in 1912. It was the opposite to that. Like, you know what I mean? Like it's 2022 because, and here's what it is, right? American universities, Australian academia, if you will. Now, academics are not people wearing stuffy suits. They're people with pink hair and they're talking about their identity politics and their sexual whatever. Well, the academics that were under, you know, the Reagan era, under the Nixon era, were probably as debaucherous behind closed doors. What's that? There's that famous prostitute who had sex with like 8 presidents and 10,000 men, whatever. You know, that happened. It just wasn't on TikTok. But now they're just wearing a different avatar. That's all it is. It's just they just don't look like what a politician should look like or what a thing. And they're pushing their agenda. But why is that agenda worse? Like, I mean, don't get me wrong. I don't support that agenda, but I'm just fascinated why someone can like we could have a libertarian candidate like Austin Peterson celebrate and support the mass bombing of Japan, and every Japanese civilian deserved to die because of Pearl Harbor. But no American deserved to die because of the foreign policies in the United States in 9/11. That would be absurd to say that. No American human being would ever say that, like not, you know, in a comfortable manner. But to say that we can kill tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of human beings, innocent civilians, because they attacked us and their government attacked us, is okay. You can have people say that. and that's accepted.
Mm-hmm.
And we're making friends with these people because they're not a trans woman, man on TikTok saying something stupid. These people are saying stupid things because it's getting them likes and shares, and because I don't think they represent the entire community. But whatever they're saying, so long as you don't have the entity of government and the entity of public health, these people have very little power. Who's going to take their kids to them besides some weird people in the commune or their own little group? To me, what's more concerning is when people are celebrating burning little girls, murdering little boys, starving them. Like say what's happening in Yemen right now.
Right.
How many of these conservatives, if people had as much passion for what's happening in American schools with, this trans that they would in Yemen, we would probably have seen Yemeni kids being fed by now. Mm-hmm. But it shows an inconsistency. I know you have guests on that talk about it, like especially Scott and things like that. They've been talking about it since 2015. But why is it the conservatives that are supposedly the allies of libertarianism, they do not give a flying heck about a child in Iran, in Yemen, in Afghanistan? They will watch American Sniper and they'll masturbate over it intellectually, all excited and all that because, yeah, America. But then when there's a drone strike, like the last drone strike in Afghanistan last year that killed that family, they will give it a context. They will give it a rationalization. But they will never be attacked by it. And we'll make friends out of these people because, we want them on our side. No, we don't. We should be consistent. It's not left or right. It's individualism. It's liberty. And if some person who has freakish ideologies wants to teach children, well, criticize them, condemn them, criticize school. That's the thing. But it's not the most important thing in the world right now. But for some reason right now in the United States, it is. And all that's going to happen is a law is going to get passed and there's going to be unintended consequences. There's going to be creep, and that law is going to go after other things. I don't know. It's going to go after trans people. It's going to say, we have to do a background check on you. And, you attended a gay bar. You can't, I'm making this up, obviously, this is not going to happen. But, on and on. It's always creep. It always expands. So instead of going, we need more laws, we need to nationalize Disneyland because of the sex grooming scandal, and tax them more. That should not be a libertarian perspective. That should not be celebration just because we don't like the last 5 years of Disney products. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's absurd.
Yeah.
But that's how it's all becoming. And that's the dangerous thing. It's like, and that's the whole Thatcherite, Reaganite perspective of libertarianism, where it's libertarianism in supposed principles that never actually enacted. And that's the trouble with pragmatism. Pragmatism is Obama. You know what I mean? That's pragmatism. It's Bill Clinton. It's Bush, and that's on and on and on. And you're never going to make anyone happy. But all you're going to do is grow government, and you're going to hurt individuals. And that's what I think the problem is, at least for me.
Yeah, and when I first got into this whole liberty thing, not too long ago, but I remember I've always throughout my life have felt very aggressively apathetic about other people's lifestyles and the decisions that they make. And that was a big reason why I came into libertarianism, because like I was telling you before we started recording, I literally don't give a fuck what you think or what you do or anyone else. And not you particularly, but just anyone.
No, I got you.
I literally don't give a shit, but just leave me out of it and we'll be fine. And I think I'm trying to present the steelman position of people on the other side, the more paleo populist right folks, and I think that when it comes down to it, there was an identity crisis that was caused by COVID, that a lot of people were seriously shaken because they were seeing this happen and they were seeing the failure of their ideology to prevent it, which I think is an unfair thing because literally nothing prevented COVID. Not republicanism, not liberalism, not libertarianism, not socialism, communism, what have you. Not Christianity or Hinduism or Buddhism prevented COVID. So, but I think that this is not, all these things are nothing that we never considered before, because I remember grappling with these issues earlier on, and it always just seemed like, okay, well, the issue is the gun in the room, is that when there is a gun in the room, everyone's going to reach for that gun to shoot everyone else first. If you follow the analogy, and from what I feel like your part of your argument is that these LGBTQ people and people on the progressive SJW side, they recognize that the gun is in the room or that the gun is pointed at them, and they're trying to grab it because the gun is there. And the issue is the gun.
They're a reaction.
Yeah.
The extremes of feminism and extreme of transgenderism is a reaction to conservatism, to all the laws against them. Like, homosexuals were beaten up by the police. Now, because it's trendy, like here in Australia, like they'll have gay pride marches and the police will attend. Well, hang on, 30, 40 years ago, you were bashing them and throwing them into rivers. You know, like you were, gays were being sodomized with nightsticks, being completely beaten. And in England, some laws, if you were under the suspicion of looking gay, you could be jailed. Like, you know, like I was reading this book, it was really interesting. It was written in 1955 and then amended in 1968. And it's talking about much of this. And it was just talking about the morality of it. And it always comes back to, you know, it's about the children. Well, a man sodomizes another man, therefore he could sodomize a child. Huh? How'd you get to there? That says
right.
more about the lawmaker or the person who's fantasizing, the neurotic that's looking at another person's lifestyle and that juxtaposition. Well, you know what? Gay men have tastes that are varied as ours, as a straight man. Like, I'm pretty sure that just because someone's a woman doesn't mean that you want to jump on top. You know what I mean? Like, you're going to be discriminatory. Like, same with gay men. Like, not all gay men are the same, and they're certainly not attracted to children. A lot of them are not. Like, there are problems with every community and all that, but for some reason, it's always the outsiders that need to dictate and always need to make these decisions for these communities. And every gay person suddenly is an ambler. You know what I mean? Well, you know, that's the thing. And it's like, well, no, hang on, they're not. And then the libertarian movement is getting involved in this and is wanting more government and more oversight to impose itself because there is an apparent homosexual problem, trans problem, or whatever else. It's absurd. It's really dangerous because every gay man is an individual. Every gay woman is an individual. And this modern LGBT, SQ, they're asking for awareness and they're asking for you know, acceptance, because for generations of human history in Western culture, probably especially the 20th century, there has been a very Puritan hatred of them. It's been a in the closet sort of thing, literally in the closet sort of thing. And now they're out. Like, you know, like say, you know, someone in England, for example, could be lobotomized for being homosexual in the past. You know, they could be jailed because they consider the what's the word they use? It's a derogatory term. But my point being is, this is a reaction. Feminism is a reaction to, you know, there was a patriarchy, you know, like token politics of affirmative action is a reaction to racism. We don't like these reactions, but that is statism. Statism is always this oversteering. Like, you know, you can have a hardcore fascist government, you know, Pinochet, or you could have a harder left government, Allende, if he had gone down that path. The problem is government. It's this monopoly that either side takes over. Like your gun analogy, they take over the institution of government, they infuse it with their own ideology, and most of the bureaucrats, most of the police officers, most of the teachers or whatever, all these public servants and public officials, they do not care about the ideology. They are just doing their job. Every election, Liberal, Labor, Republican, Democrat, the same bureaucrats, the same public servants that are working the DMV, that are working in the government departments, they have the same jobs. They do not care. They don't care about the ideology. If it's the Weimar Republic, if it's the Nazi government, if it's the French Republic, if it's the Vichy government, you know what I mean? If it's the Russian Federation, or if it's the Soviet Union, they still have a job. And that is the problem. They're the ones that do all the work, not, you know, Obama never personally killed anyone, but a lot of people died under his tenureship. To me personally, the people that are pulling the triggers, operating the drones, they're the problem. Not President Obama. He's no magician with magical powers that can change your mind and my mind and make us into fiendish killers. He's just the head of a government that's apparently elected, and the mob of the public has say in his election process. The individuals doing the killing are the problem. The individuals that are making that possible are the problem. And there is one entity, the monopoly, the government, that continues to perpetuate that. So right now, there's a left-wing sort of problem in American politics, for example. So in 10 years' time, when neoconservatives get in because of the overreaction, we're going to be talking about that. If we're liberty-minded, we're going to be talking about that.
Right.
Like, you know what I mean? Like, to be left-wing, like, the cancel culture canceled musicians and artists during the Bush years. You know what I mean? There was cancel culture then, like the Dixie Girls, the Dixie Chicks, right? Perfect example, right? Now the cancel culture is a left-wing phenomenon, sort of thing. You know what I mean? But then if it comes out that you were sending nude photos to a married woman consensually, you can be cancelled by your own peers. You can be cancelled by your own family. You can be cancelled by your own political group, or you can be ignored by it. You know what I mean? The cancel community is very fluid, the whole concept. But the thing is being cancel-less. You know what I mean? Not being dependent upon that. And so I think a lot of these people within the Medusian Liberty piece, I'm talking about predominantly females, obviously, in that piece, but they are just, they've had enough. They just don't want, they are they are the wildflowers of liberty. Nature is beautiful. It's chaotic. It's very unique. Like, you can have a forest, but it's made up by a lot of trees. You can go out in the bush and it's made up of infinite amount of trees, and none of them abide by a particular pattern or a conformist thing, but it still becomes nature. And that's what I think a lot of these people believe and feel. And I think that we can learn something from that. Like, even the song lyrics that I use, that's done by a friend who's a beautiful singer. And so she wrote this song, and I used the lyrics because that isn't just about being a female or a trans or whatever. That's about being an individual. And the thing is, if someone is always told that they are a woman, they're going to identify as a woman, but they're always being attacked for being a woman. You know, it's something as simple as going to the beach in a bikini, right? Now, you and I, as a male, we might acknowledge, oh, there's a pretty lady there in a bikini, right? Now, what we do with that information is up to us. If we gawk and film that person, that's horrible. That's not fair. If we go up to them and consistently approach them and impose ourselves onto them, then that's a problem. Then their reaction to that is, all men at the beach are creeps. Okay, so that's not all men, but that's just some men. So there's a reaction, there's a rejection of that. And that's what a lot of these women are finding. And I found in the past, when I coached women that had been sexually assaulted and raped and bashed and that, it was by men, you know. So what's their reaction to that? They're going to have trust issues. They're going to have trust issues if a lot of women, domestic violence women, police officers and prison guards, for example, you know, or people in the government, right? People of power, soldiers, okay, people of authority, right? These sacred conservative heroes. There's a domestic violence problem within those communities. Individuals, a lot of the individuals that did the sexual assault to some of these women have mental health issues, but the state protects these individuals because it determines that mental health people can't be necessarily punished. And in Australia, we have a real big mental health sort of boondoggle going on, where there's a lot of like a national disability scheme going on, where there's a lot of jobs. If you and I identify as depressed, for example, we can get certain disability things. And so there's a massive thing going on like that. Yeah, I know, it's crazy. And there's a lot of jobs, people are making a lot of money out of it. Like, for example, people are, not to segue off, but people are going, they're no longer being personal trainers, physical personal trainers. They're going in to be carers for mental health people because the money is insane. And that's a government-directed initiative. So what happens is, when you have individuals like some of these women, or even girls at the time, were sexually assaulted and abused by someone who's a schizophrenic, but then that schizophrenic's not punished, but then gets put on a pension and a benefit scheme and is protected by the police, protected by these other people, and at best you might get victims of crime payments. You're treated like a piece of shit. You know what I mean? You're a victim and you suffer in silence. You might get given a state-mandated therapist who doesn't really help you, who's also doing therapy for the person who just raped you. It's an absurdity. So the entity is what creates it. And here's the good one, right? Now think about this. Let's say you're an uncle, right? And this is anecdotal, but I'll give you an example. Let's say your niece has been sexually assaulted horribly. The man that does that is able to walk around in polite society, even stalk her a little bit. The police, you know, they're just doing a job. They're not going to protect her. In Australia, she can't arm herself to protect herself, right? So she's better off just getting raped than she is defending herself, as far as the recourse of the state goes. If you as an uncle or a parent goes up to that individual that's doing that to that woman and says, if you don't leave my daughter / niece alone, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to hurt you. Leave her alone. You will probably face more time and be punished more than the person, because of his mental health problems in this case, will ever do for the rape, the violent aggravated assault. He might do 2 to 3 years if he does get done. You with threat, if you're a firearms owner, a legal firearms owner, and you threaten someone that's harming your family, you might face up to 25 years in jail in Australia. The problem's with the state. They've decided those rules. You know what I mean? That is a problem. And a lot of people can agree with us. Cops can agree with you. You know what I mean? If it's their family on the line, they'll agree with you certainly, but they're still going to enforce those laws. And that's the problem, you know what I mean? And so I see it. So you've got these women that are individuals that are told they're not allowed to protect themselves. They can't carry a gun in Australia. They can't carry a knife. They want to be left alone. A lot of them have been sexually assaulted and abused. So what they know is they can only trust themselves because the community's failed them, because community almost doesn't exist when you have government departments and professionalized services. The police are indifferent. The police are just doing a job or whatever. Their own family doesn't know how to juggle it sometimes. So what do they want to do? They want to be left alone. And that, to me, is the perfect representation of the Gadsden flag, you know. And a lot of them, they're heavily caught up in self-defense, which is why I come across a lot of them. They want to learn fight stuff and that. They're really into physical fitness. They're learning skills. They're learning how to be mechanics on their vehicles. They're learning how to pick locks. They're learning how to parkour so they can escape over fences and all this sort of stuff. They're doing all this sort of stuff because they want to be independent. Meanwhile, we've got a bunch of neckbeards that are making memes talking about liberty and how they're going to storm, I don't know, Roswell or whatever else is going on. And that is who we think as the outliers of liberty. But the outliers of liberty have no social media accounts. And if at best they're lurkers, they're the real heroes. You know, they're the ones that are doing it. And most of it just comes down to literally they want to be left alone. And two things continuously harass, in this case, these individuals harass. Men, okay? Not all men, but some men, all right? Or the government. The government is the one that's charged with protecting them. You know, we're here to protect. I mean, someone used this term. I can't remember who it was. They call it anarcho-tyranny.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know if you remember. Yeah, perfect term. The government's not there to protect you from being robbed, raped, murdered, etc. But they will rock up and arrive, and they'll validate themselves because of the crime that's been committed against you. But these women that have been sexually assaulted and raped, they will charge them registration. They'll make them get licenses. They'll make them pay all these taxes and all these things, but they certainly weren't there to protect them, and they will deny them the right to protect themselves. So the anarcho aspect, the worst aspects of anarchism, but they're being hindered by the state. And so the LGBT, the SJWs out there that are talking about women's rights are completely mute on that. And the pro-gun individuals, big masculine men out there, they're going to go shooting with their cop mates on the weekend, are completely mute on that. And so who's the champion for these individuals? Themselves. And they're not podcasting, they're not memeing, they're not on social media. They're living day to day, and they just want to be free. And I think we should celebrate that more. And that is one segment of the community. Within the sex workers community, there's probably scores more individuals, male and females, whether they're OnlyFans operators. I mean, I can think of nothing more libertarian than OnlyFans. You know what I mean? Think about it. You are selling photos of your feet and making money on the free market because the problem is that the person selling the money of their gastronomical exploits into a can, it's not the person who's selling that, it's the market. There's a market for it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Now we as anti-prohibitionists, we should be celebrating that. I don't drink alcohol. Doesn't mean I'm against alcohol. I don't take drugs. I'm not against drugs. But just because someone wants to eat mushrooms or smoke weed doesn't mean that they're bad. There's a market for it. I don't agree with it. Now, if some guy wants to huff the essence from a gamer girl and pay good money for it, we should celebrate in the market. We shouldn't be against that. Just because we don't agree with it morally or whatever else doesn't mean that we have to disagree with it. We should be celebrating it. But then we have libertarians that were auditing thoughts. You know what I mean? That were reporting on OnlyFans girls so that they could pay taxes. Libertarians. You know what I mean? It's insane. It's just jealousy, resentment, and conservative values in the Puritan sense. And I think what's happening is we ironically are creating a fraction within the liberty movement, and we don't realize that we are doing that. And there is a lot of allies out there who are not like you and I, who are not, heterosexual men, that are not like us, but share everything that you and I share dear, probably even conservative values, that just want to be left alone. And guess who the same enemy is? The state.
Right.
The state is what's hamstringing them from protecting themselves, from being individuals, and the state is what's taxing them and punishing them. It's punishing them for working. Anyone that's self-employed in Australia knows how horrible it is. You're better off going on a pension in Australia and identifying as depressed or anxiety-riddled than you are working in small business. You're literally punished. And that's how it is. And that's like, I'm sure it's the same in America in many states and probably California, for example, probably like that. And that's the enemy. The enemy is the entity, and the entity is indifferent to ideology or morality. Its existence is its only self-importance. It's a cancer. You know what I mean? It just grows. It only ever grows. And we feed it with partisanship. We feed it with, oh, I got to vote this party. I got to vote that party. It's going to be good this time. It's going to work this time. But it never does. And I think that's the problem. So that's probably the thesis of that rant that I put up on the Institute.
Hey, everybody. Patrick McFarland here. I'm really excited to tell you guys about the newest sponsor of the Liberty Weekly podcast, and that is Crowd Health. When I launched my law practice a few months ago, I found myself without health insurance. I searched through the individual healthcare plans on healthcare.gov and was appalled at the high cost and poor coverage. So I decided to try out Crowd Health. That's right, I use Crowd Health myself. Now there's a reason why healthcare costs are so high. That is because healthcare is no longer something that takes place between you and your doctor. Everyone listening to this podcast should already know that big insurance and big pharma unite with big government to squeeze every penny that they can from you. This, of course, drives costs up. For instance, Obamacare caps the percentage of profit that health insurance companies can make off of premiums. How then do they make more money? Well, they charge a higher premium. So there's no incentive for insurance companies to negotiate for lower prices on your behalf. Enter Crowd Health. You pay one low monthly total, usually less than $200, to fund a healthcare account that is yours. Then you choose whatever doctor that you want. And if you have a big bill, Crowd Health will crowdfund that bill for you so you can pay the doctor or hospital quickly. Now, to help you along the way, Crowd Health will assign you and your family a personal care representative. My care representative is named Maggie, and if I have any questions, Maggie is just a text or a phone call away. When I enrolled, Maggie called me to get to know me. We spent a great deal of time discussing my needs and goals with my own healthcare. Maggie's great. Stop supporting the broken health insurance system with your hard-earned dollars. Go to joincrowdhealth.com now and experience freedom from health insurance like I do. Right now, you can get your first 3 months for just $99 per month. That's almost 50% off the normal price, and it's a heck of a lot less than a high-deductible healthcare plan. So just go to joincrowdhealth.com and use promo code LW99 at sign-up to tell them that I sent you. That's joincrowdhealth.com, promo code the letter L, the letter W, and the number 99. Now, disclaimer, Crowd Health is not health insurance, and that's a good thing. It's a totally different way of paying for health care. Terms and conditions may apply.
Yep.
Well, the main question is, right, that Rothbard posed is, do you hate the state? I think that's the main question. And are you familiar with the concept of like thick versus thin libertarianism?
No, what's that? Sorry.
So it was this concept, and a few years ago, at least, it was something that I adhered to pretty closely, was if you're a thin libertarian, you're someone who thinks that anyone can be a libertarian as long as they believe in property rights and the non-aggression principle. So you're a thin libertarian if, you know, you could be a David Duke racist and be a libertarian as long as you believed in private property and the non-aggression principle. You could be, you know, the most degenerate, I don't know, sex whatever person, and you could be a libertarian even if you, as long as you believed in property rights and the non-aggression principle. And thick libertarianism is when you try to attach your own personal convictions onto being a libertarian. Like, you know, that I think like the Cato Institute types, or like, I don't know, the cosmopolitan libertarians would try to attach, you know, social justice and cosmopolitanism to being a libertarian, that you have to be those things to be a libertarian. And I've always been a thin libertarian, and it seems like more recently it has always been the left wing of libertarianism, in my experience, that has been thick libertarians, but now the right is doing the same. Sorry.
Yeah, I think so. Like, have you read any of Ayn Rand's rants on certain things, like, you know, why jazz music is bad?
No, but
that's so, okay. So you've got that. So I mean, okay, she's an objectivist or whatever, but she's pretty much like, she is a fascinating human being and has written some interesting things that, you know, she's thought provoking, right? So there is this belief that because I enjoy a genre of music, let's say, this genre of music is it's validated by my taste, and therefore it must be a libertarian thing. It must be a liberty thing. So my pseudo ideology or whatever, my taste in movies is important, and I can't agree with you if you like Marvel and I like DC, or vice versa. You know what I mean? Because I am more libertarian, DC must be, or because you're more libertarian, Marvel must be, for example. You know what I mean? So what happens is all these tastes and these degenerate instincts and that, or even racism and bigotry, all of these things are not, like you said, are not thick aspects, and we've got to change it and purge it. But what happens is the liberty movement's become homogenized. So it's become very American, it's become very Judeo-Christian, and it's become very Bitcoin bro, and meme your way out of the left and all this sort of stuff. And all it's doing is it's completely ignoring all the other flavors of the rainbow, if you will. And yeah, like you said, being a thin libertarian is really important. But the trouble is, we get caught up in the culture war stuff. We get caught up in partisan politics and all that because it's right now. But in 2 years, 2 months time, especially how the internet works, it's going to be stupid to even bring it up. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you know, like we're not talking about the stupidity of laws against planking right now, or how we've got to ban Pokemon Go or fidget spinners. But for that period of time, that was what everyone wanted to talk about. And that was, you know, there was discourse and all that. And the same thing's happening right now. And we forget the big picture. The big picture is, do you need to force someone against their will to impose your ideologies on that person? You know what I mean? Like if my next door neighbor is minding their own business and, you know, he's not being too loud or whatever else, and they're not doing bad things, I don't care that he has a sex dungeon or she has a sex dungeon. That's none of my business. I don't want to be in that sex dungeon. I don't want people to be pulled into that sex dungeon. But you know what? If that's what they've got, then good for them. If they're happy, then so be it. But if my next door neighbor to the other side is, you know, conservative Christians, they go on to church on Sunday and all that, that's great. But I don't want door knocking and coming to my house every day telling me that I'm going to go to hell if I don't, you know, accept Christ in my life.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, what's the difference? You know what I mean? Like, as long as they can be good friends. But you know the crazy thing that I always think about it, right? John Wayne Gacy, for example, he was a pretty big pillar of the community. A lot of these people were, you know, use Bundy again. All these people, like, you know, his Republican politics, Bundy was, and all this sort of thing. And I can't remember who it was, but in the Republican Party had that in the early 80s, like some of their funders and some of the even members of the Republican Party itself were involved in really horrible sex trafficking where they pull children off the street.
Wasn't the Franklin scandal or the Franklin cover-up? Yeah.
Upstanding, respectable.
Dennis
in the
Hastert.
United Kingdom.
Hastert,
in the United Kingdom. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. In the United Kingdom, Jimmy Savile, for example, he was tied up with the establishment and the public health system and the prisons, the youth detention systems, all the upstanding individual. The biggest debaucherist out there. The difference between those debaucherists and ones that are doing it in their privacy is coercion. And what gives these individuals power? The state. You know what I mean? The whole Epstein thing, for example, like, you know, however deep it goes and however conspiratorial it may be or whatever, it's the entity of the state that gives these individuals so much power and influence. Whether they're a corporate, wealthy corporate person, you know, they get the subsidies, they've got regulation that protects them so that small business and free market doesn't exist. So they have that neo-fascist model that we have now in the West where big business and big government go hand in hand. These people have so much power and wealth because of the state, all right? And whether it's a politician, whether it's a person that's a diplomat, whether it's Jeffrey Epstein himself, like, you know, using this because it's trending all the time, these people have so much power because of the entity itself. Now, you don't have to agree with their debauchery or whatever else, but the difference is consistently what gives them the power to coerce the state. And you can have these people, you could sit down with a pastor and you can talk to him about, you know, Christ, and you can talk about faith and all that sort of stuff. And you know what? He may be downloading the most horrible, heinous images in the world, but his facade, he speaks the speaks. That's politics. And that's the ideology of pretend and the avatar of conservatism. And you might have a guy that is completely covered in, you know, tattoos and news rings and all that. And he's going, oh, I've got like 3 partners. And they, you know, I tell my wife, my girlfriend, all that, exactly what I'm doing. I completely communicate with them. I have no secrets with them. I tell them we're in a functioning polyamorous relationship. But he's not coercing anyone. He's honest. Can you say that about most married people? You know, that they don't resent, that they don't lie. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But I've noticed oftentimes some of these polyamorous people, they're in open relationships, open communication, big factor. And we create them into caricatures and we talk about them being these completely disgusting human beings that are debaucherous and antithesis to liberty and all that. But it's like, but why? You know what I mean? Like, because they don't want to abide by a Judeo-Christian concept of marriage that the state has sanctified, and the state now charges, regulations and tax and all that. Like, you know what I mean? It's insane. Like, we're just perpetuating it. And that's what I think the problem is. And I think one more thing I'll add quickly as well is, if I'm ever going to be punished as a writer, if I ever, heaven forbid, become successful at writing, I don't think it's going to be a non-fiction piece that I'm going to be punished for. It's going to be a fiction piece. And it's going to be the conservative Puritan instincts that's going to go after it. It's going to be, if I write erotic fiction, if I write a horror story, if I write a war story, it'll be the fiction, and it'll be the conservative censorship mindset that we have that bans horror movies that we were talking about beforehand, like, that want to make them video nasties. That was not the left that created the video nasty crave. It's not the left that wanted to ban Friday the 13th or Halloween. And that makes the director constantly edit it. It is the right. It is a Christian conservative mindset. And for artists and creators, the good thing about art, for example, is a segue off, is we can choose not to look at it. But we can't choose not to abide by the government, because they will force themselves upon us. And it's always just people doing their job that's going to stop an artist from being an artist, or a writer from being a writer, or a musician from being a musician. And it's always going to be the conservative elements that are going to decide that what they're doing is subversive to the moral parameters of society, however that's determined. And that, to me, is the problem. Left, right, I do not care about. They're both the same boot, to use that analogy, that crushes individual liberty. I think the problem is the state itself, and we need to be more focused upon that. And I think the liberty movement's making too many. There's this term, post-libertarianism. Well, I don't even know what that means. You know what I mean? Post-libertarianism, okay? Because libertarianism is defined by the American experience, libertarianism. There's a lot of versions of libertarianism out there. In fact, it was a left-wing term long before the Americans discovered it. And I think the trouble is that we're going down a left-right paradigm, and I think that's creating a lot of enemies. And to be honest, you listen to Scott's show, how many left-wing people are on there that he has talking about anti-war stuff, and they are more consistent. And I think we can actually have more conversations and bring them over to individual liberty than we can some of the right-wing guests that he has on. You know what I mean? And I'm not left-wing. I am not left-wing by any means. I am anti-big government at all. But I'm not conservative either. I just think coercion's wrong. But I just feel I'm just defending certain lifestyles from an anthropological and sympathetic perspective, if that makes sense, than I am. Like, I'm defending a Muslim's right to exist from, neoconservative bombs from a humanitarian perspective. And I think that's what we need to do more of. Like, we need to see the world in other people's shoes. And we do. You and I, when we're talking about right-wing anti-war issues, we're not. It's not us that are. You had Laurie Calhoun on, right? She's talking about how children have to change their habits to, when it's sunny, they don't go outside. They disperse when they hear the drones and all that. Who's doing that? That's us. That's our governments. That's us. That's the West that's doing that to these children. But who's the voice for those children? You might have a guest on your show or Scott's show. Mainstream libertarians and conservatives and all that, are they talking about that? I would, like, to those people, they're not worried about a luxury is worried about a teacher teaching pronouns. That is a luxury. That's a privilege. You know, it's not a luxury? Being able to feed your kids tomorrow. Not worrying about a bomb blowing up your house because the United States government's determined that because of 18 degrees of separation that you might be an insurgent. Or, getting access to medication. That is a luxury that you and I have, that we don't have to fight or face, and it's our government. It's that monopoly. And it doesn't matter if it's left. It doesn't matter if it's a trans person that's operating those drones. It doesn't matter if it's a conservative Christian that's operating those drones, because both of them will do it obediently, because they are doing their job. And that's how the rest of the world sees the West. And that's how the people over in Afghanistan, in Iraq, Yemen, or whatever, they see the West. They see Christian values. They see Jewish values. And if you're a Palestinian in Israel, in Palestine at the moment, liberal democracy values, they see it through violence and war. Why would anyone believe democracy works when every time there's an election in those countries, the liberal democracy West overthrows them and installs a military junta? We don't see it empathetically. We see it through ideological bias. What is Western values, for example? To you, what is Western values? What would you define as Western values? You know what I mean? Individual liberty, yeah?
Yeah, individual liberty, due process, all that kind of stuff.
But when do Western governments practice that? Here's what Western values are: central banking, fascism, modern communism, just war theory, nuclear, biological, chemical warfare, certain neo-imperialism, like, you know, corporate imperialism that happens in Africa and places like that, preemptive wars, all these sorts of things. That's Western values. That's how we practice it. You know what I mean? Even some would argue chattel slavery in the American experience versus the experience, or even in the Spanish experience versus what was happening in Africa and the Arab world. You know, like mechanizing slavery to the level that it was before the ancient world, and how other cultures have done it. That is Western values. But for some reason we go, oh, here is Henry David Thoreau. He wrote this book. That's Western values. No, he was a radical. He was an outlier in his time, and he certainly won. Walden and civil discourse is not exactly a widespread piece of agreement, but we want to pretend that it's Western values. No, it's not. You know, there's more libertarianism and Daoism, you know, and certain Eastern values, but you'd be called an Orientalist if you go into that. But we celebrate Western values, but Western values is World War II and World War I, the Cold War. That's Western values, and look what that did to the world. But we want to pretend that it's not. Western values is censorship, prohibition, taxation. You know, that's Western values as well, you know, but we pretend it isn't. And that's what the problem is. So I think what we need to do as individuals is celebrate individualism, heaven forbid, and what Western values were, and that is liberalism in the lower L. And you know, if someone is a debaucherous and they want to leave you alone and you leave them alone, so long as they're not raping and murdering, you know, and in doing that sort of stuff, then yeah, that's fine. You know, it's not my cup of tea, but heck, going to church on Sunday is not my cup of tea anymore. I've done that. I've been there. I don't want to do that again. But it doesn't mean I'm against it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's my tangent on it all.
No worries. And I want to read a couple paragraphs from your piece, actually, because I really appreciate the prose, but these were the two that I keyed in on just to kind of put a bookend on this. But you say, inside the tangents thrown against the social justice left, the dignity of the individual is lost. Liberty is not a conforming blanket that is made for those of a particular nation or language, those of a monotheistic God, or any religion for that matter. It belongs to everyone. Liberty is feral, the bush beyond the picket fences and managed lawns. And yet those who only know the conformity of a house cannot imagine the home of others should it differ in structure and routine. That is a condemnation of those who lack imagination in their own insecurities, not for those who wish to live outside of such constraints. For some, agency and energy is more important than income and perceived security. And this is another paragraph. In an attempt to challenge the contemporary left ideology of some Western governments, one may forget the anti-freedom of past conservatives and those on the right. The cancel culture of men like Jack Thompson, whose crusades against video games and music was not unique to just him, but an entire cult of right-wing moralizers, always found exemptions in their sacred constitution and for freedom itself. When the pendulum returns, it will be those crusaders who will be burning the podcasters at the stake for different reasons, but always an anti-liberty one. Those women of their own destiny will become the witches of the modern era, vilified and hounded because they may choose to be child-free or do not want a man to watch over them. So I think that people are not, they should be, but they're not having these conversations. I have not really found that people on this new populist movement have been having conversations with people like you, and really, I mean, honest and fair conversations, I think, is what's needed, because to recoil and to be reactionary, I think it's easy and it has momentum, but having these tough conversations, I think is something worth doing, obviously.
Yeah, well, I think I agree. I totally agree. I think the trouble is, within the podcast world and even on social media, it becomes the same voices. Everyone's listening to the same things, and it's the same things. Like, you know, like at the moment, Tim Pool, for example, is really popular. He's got certain values and he's got certain things, but it always leads back to the government. And it's that Minikist perspective that if only government was contained and constrained, same with Joe Rogan, for example, and then even with the Liberty movement. Sorry, I've got a flower I got for my mum, and it's making me get allergies. So that's why I'm trying to stop myself from sneezing. I'm not allergic to it, but anyway. So what I was saying is, you've got all these same voices, but it all comes back to the Constitution. Well, when did the Constitution in the United States ever do anything for liberty? like manifest destiny, the Monroe Doctrine, slavery, what happened to the Native Americans and things like that. Like the Seminole Indians, for example, the taking on free slaves, and whites that wanted to reject the conformities and the constraints of their own societies would flee down there. And then what happened? Washington found them. The United States government found them. There's no frontiers anymore. So the only frontiers exist up here. And we do not have a place where we can go to be free. And so the problem is always comes down to, where is it that individuals that want to be free and communities that want to be free are allowed to go? Because it's always the people that want to control others that are always finding us and always extrapolating from us. We should make them into allies. We should just say, look, this is my opinion. You and I can, let's say, right now we went somewhere and we sat down and have a conversation over a meal. We would probably have different tastes in music, different tastes in this, but we'd also have similar tastes in music. We are neither right or wrong. But so long as our tastes do not, I'm not forcing you to take my taste, I'm not mandating my taste and vice versa, then there's no problem. And the same thing goes to certain moralities. And I think the difference between ideology and philosophy is ideology is imposing yourself on others and philosophy is self. And I think the libertarian movement has become very ideological and it's very nationalistic. And I think the problem with libertarianism and liberty movement is it's nationalism. And you can take from the nationalism from whatever, the sacredness of American borders or the American institutions, same with Australia. But does that mean that my voice is not important? Or does that mean that someone's voice from China is not important, or wherever else? If they are espousing libertarian virtues and philosophies, do they have less value? But because the liberty movement is very much dominated at the moment by culturally by the United States, there's that bias, and it becomes extremely homogenized, and it becomes extremely corrupt by American concerns. These are all caricatures, of course, generalizations, but American concerns and American values. But outside of that is like there is different languages and there's different understandings of liberty. And so what I was trying to do with that Medusian piece is trying to give voice to that, because a house is not a home. A house, if you're a child that's being abused, a house can be a frightening place to come back to, but it can also be a home, But people can also live in a van, they can live in a teepee, they can live nomadically. That doesn't mean they're right or wrong. Like someone living nomadically as a Ronin, from gym to gym, for example. I know guys that go from gym to gym and they sleep in the car park. They're pretty happy and they're pretty cool dudes and they're self-funded and all that. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. Same with some of these ladies. But for some reason, we're always pushing, and now especially, we're pushing this narrative that we can only have, marriage, Christian marriage. Women must be this and mission that. So does that mean that a female's voice is subjective, is subservient to the male voice now in the liberty movement? Because, that's the values. It's insane. I just don't understand it. To me, it doesn't make any sense to me. To me, the whole family unit argument being pro-liberty, given that we've just gone through hundreds of thousands of generations of statism, where the family unit has been the way, is absurd. I mean, I just don't, that's my whole thesis of this piece. And I think just because someone doesn't want to have children doesn't make them anti-children or doesn't love children. They've got a lot of reasons for it. Like a person that doesn't have children, for example, because I mentioned that a few times, she as a woman should not have to justify that. You know what I mean? Or a man who is single and that has had multiple relationships, good, healthy, friendly relationships. If you can break up with someone and maintain a friendship with that someone, to me, that's more healthier than breaking up and hating someone that you've had children with, that you love, that you shared passions with. But that's considered normal. You know what I mean? Like why? These are certain moral individual things that we should reflect upon. Just because it's normal and it's conforming doesn't mean that it's healthy, And I think that the libertarian movement is suffering because of human bias, because we are all human beings. But that doesn't mean that we have to all be the same. We can all be different, you know what I mean? But at the same time, we can all share the same ideals and freedoms. And that's what I think Libertopia should be like. But unfortunately, we're a long way from there. And I think most of that problem is in our own minds, and that's our own mentalities. But yeah, so hopefully that's what makes sense out of all that.
Yeah, no, well, I think that echoes back.
How's that?
Yeah. Well, there are a bunch of people, who I've noticed this with people like Derek Bros and like The Last American Vagabond, people that you would see at Anarchapulco, right? Are you familiar with these people?
No, not those people. I've heard of the Last Vagabond, but I don't know much about them.
Oh, okay. Well, there is a branch of libertarians who I would say, they're not in the whole Mises orbit, like the Mises Institute orbit, that kind of thing, where they go to Anarchapulco. They are more about, I would say they're more like crunchy, more like hippies, if you know what I mean. That they seem to me to be more culturally left. And I think a lot, you mentioned Larkin Rose. He's someone who goes to these things a lot. And I think that there seems to be more of a growing rift, or not really a rift because that implies animosity, but just kind of a separation a bit more between these groups. And although there is some crossover, I just don't think that that's necessarily like a positive development. And maybe it's because the Mises orbit is getting more thick on the right.
What's the finality of the Mises thing? Like, I know they're trying to take over the Libertarian Party. So you're going to have the people like Dave Smith and the whole Mises caucus. They're going to come in. They're going to get power. They're going to have all this energy. They're going to get more members of the Libertarian Party in the United States. And then 8 years' time, the Libertarian Party will become the Libertarian Party that it is now. You're going to have all former Republicans that are not doing so well in the Republican movement, maybe some Democrats. You're going to have your Gary Johnsons and all those types are going to return to it because they're the ones that are interested in politics to that level. Because most people that are liberty-minded, proper liberty-minded, they're not involved in party politics because they think it's absurd. And is it going to be that cycle that every 6 elections that the Libertarian Party needs to be reformed, or we're going to start up a new anarchistic party? The left does it all the time, like communist parties and Green Party. Or then, like to say the Libertarian Party, you can have extremes. You can have a John McAfee and a Vernon Supreme, who are kind of just absurdities. They're never going to be elected. But then I'll go back to Austin Peterson and things like that, who are what is he? What is he? Is he a Republican? Is he just a small government nationalist? Like, you know what I mean? Like, is he just a guy that's taken on the moniker of libertarian? Like, most people claim that the founding fathers, as different as all of them were in many ways minarchists and libertarians. Would you ever own a slave?
No.
I would never own a slave. To me, that's a big fact. Like, I don't care what Tom. I grew up, loving Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and reading. I'd borrow from, as a kid, borrow from the library books, and I'd write it in my own handwriting, the stuff that they said. It would be romance by it all. And then I couldn't get past the fact that they actually owned people against their will. And a lot of libertarians and conservatives think that's a little thing. That's a left-wing thing. Oh my God, that was a sign of their times. Well, there's a lot of abolitionists at their time too. There was a lot of, John Adams, for example, never had to force human beings against their will. John Adams had a very healthy relationship with his wife too. And he also, he treated her as an equal. He should be celebrated. Thomas Jefferson, we don't know if he raped his slaves. He had sexual relations with them. Now, if you kidnapped a family or a group of people and you had them over time, they were completely dependent upon you, and you got them to work on your land, you fed them and you sheltered them and all that, and then you started to have sexual relations with some of the women, how would someone view that? Was that coercive? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But conservatives seem okay with that. To me, I'm not okay with that. Like, I think that's great. If there's any American revolution that should be celebrated, it should be the Haitian Revolution, because it was people throwing off tyranny. It wasn't about slavery, but Americans are obsessed with their founding fathers. But then they won't even talk about the crimes of their founding fathers. And then when a lot of people talk about the slavery issue, it becomes a left-wing issue or it becomes a race issue. And then what you're doing is you're marginalizing individuals who are pro-liberty and who may be of another color, who are going, well, hang on, if I lived back then, I probably would have been owned by a Virginian slave master, That's a real issue to talk about. And to me, for liberty, that's a big factor. And so the whole what's the word I'm looking for? The seed of the problem comes back to history, and it's the omissions of history. It's like if you talk about the Roman Empire, but you ignore all the genocides and you ignore all the pederasty and you ignore all this other stuff, you're omitting facts. It'd be like, like talking about Hitlerianism and you omit the Holocaust, you become a David Irving or something like that. These facts are incredibly important because they define these individuals. And I think what happens is over time, we moralize these people and we make them out to be these great heroes of liberty. But it's like, they weren't. Andrew Jackson, just because he was against central banking doesn't make him a good person. You know what I mean? Like, he did horrible things. He shot prisoners. The Trail of Tears is a pretty horrible thing. That is a bigger cross against his name than, I don't like central banks.
Right. I mean? Yeah.
Like, you know,
Or at
like there's
least
some
it
people
should
that
be.
read, you
Yeah.
know, there's some people, yeah, exactly. But the people that are caught up on central banking and anti-Keynesian economics and all that sort of stuff, that to them, libertarianism is an economics concept and all that. Like it's Austrian versus, you know, statist economics. Well, human bondage, murder, torture, genocide is more important than central banking. I mean, you know, like realistically. Then they go, oh, well, if it wasn't for central banking, it wouldn't be funded. I'm like, well, that's not true because it did exist before that sort of thing. But what I'm getting at is what is the end game? I mean, I'm not an American, so I was involved in the Libertarian Party here, the Liberal Democrats Party, briefly, but all they were concerned about was, you know, very token issues, and it was too tied up with the Conservative Party, at least from my experiences. So what's the end game? The Mises Caucus is going to get Dave Smith and all these these individuals who are very entertaining and very intelligent involved in the party. They're going to take back the Mises thing, and then 10 years time, what will be the end game of it?
Well, based off of what you said earlier, all these, you know, kind of milquetoast people coming back into the party, I hope that's not the case. But I mean,
but it always is.
Yeah, I'm not a LP guy. I am friendly. You know, I'm in a way. It's, I guess maybe it's kind of a cop out because I don't commit, but I'm my own creature. I just focus on my own work, and you know, I'll go to LP events and maybe I'll even speak at them. Who knows? But it's not something that, you know, I'm not a member and I'm not whatever. But I hope that's not the case. But
from my perspective is like, so what happens is, so Liberty podcasters will talk about the Mises Caucus, which is good because it's a thing, and then each subsequent election there's going to be all this energy talking about compromise, pragmatism, the Liberty Caucus, or Libertarian Party politics and all that. So it's very specific to people that are interested in that. But if you're a new person from, like, say if you're someone listening from using a VPN to listen to libertarianism and all that from China or from you know, Africa or something like that, you're constantly getting bombarded with, and this is a purview of individual podcasts. So it's your own choice of what this content will be. But if it becomes fascinated and fixated on that over and over again, but the constant theme is the same thing, all it is, it's the same. It's no different than Communist Party talking about workers' rights, while at the same time imposing laws every time they get elected that do everything to punish the worker. You know, like you're using platitudes of individual liberty, but you just become a collectivist entity. Because if you're an illegal migrant crossing the border who believes in liberty more than most people that are in the Libertarian Party probably do, you are now maligned because you're an illegal. And you're now, because the bordertarians are saying, oh, you know, libertarianism is nationalism and all this sort of stuff. So what is your party that you're going to go to? You know what I mean? Or you don't even be involved in the party because you're too busy trying to feed your family, working cash in hand jobs all over the place. I mean, for example, here in Australia, just to segue off, there was a group of brothers from India, right? They were driving around in a van and they were going to all these different work sites and they were offering themselves up to do cash labor work. They were just doing, you know, clean up stuff, like a bit of site maintenance, all this sort of stuff. Just cash in hand, so much bucks an hour, boom, they're doing it for 10 hours a day, boom, 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 to feed their families. Who do you think it was that cracked down on that sort of stuff? It was the anti-migrant types. They weren't stealing jobs from anyone. They were providing a service that people clearly wanted. There's nothing stopping the native-borns from doing that. But once again, who's making that illegal to do that? The entity, the government. They're making it illegal to do that sort of work now. But heaps of people want it. The little boy that sweeps up your snow that everyone celebrates in America, what's the entity that's against that? You know, that cash in hand work. The little girl that's operating the lemonade stand, you know? Who's the entity that's stopping that? These individuals are living liberty. They're living the free market. But going to a party and talking about partisan politics where you're never going to get a free market because the government would never allow it, and all it's doing is you're turning everything into abstracts and you're collectivizing the world because you're saying that American liberty is more important than individual liberty the world over, and that someone that's an illegal migrant, for example, or someone that's a trans woman, or someone that's you know, this and that, they're not welcome because you've collectivized the rest, because the culture war is now the current talking point. That's what I personally think the problem is. And I think it's going to hurt the anti-war message of the liberty movement, because I think the left, the old left, and the anti-imperialist left and the libertarian movement is the best thing on the wars. But when the less people talking about the war, I think the best way to delegitimize the government is to talk about all the innocent civilians that's blowing up. The best way to diminish taxation is to talk about how that's funding blowing up innocent civilians. The best way to end the police state is to talk about things that are happening to Julian Assange, censorship and prohibitions, all that sort of stuff. But instead, all it comes back down to is like these micro issues that are like so contemporary that are not evergreen and that turn into partisan politics. And I think that's going to hurt the liberty movement, especially as a non-American. That's my perspective, at least, anyway.
Yeah. One last thing I'll say before I should probably get going here, but
sorry.
No worries. The biggest issue, man, this opens a whole nother can of worms though, because like I was telling you before we even went on, talking about that Jeff Dice piece from 2017, where he talks about how self-determination is the goal and not libertarian universalism is. And one of the biggest reasons why I personally don't focus on liberty in other countries, although I do encourage it, is because I have to be cognizant of the fact that I live in the world empire. And when I talk to other people in other countries about liberty in their country, there's always the ghost of regime change. And I think you're sympathetic to that.
Well, I think the trouble for a lot of people in other countries, the term freedom and liberty means home rule. So America, as an American, like, you had the civil war between the British colonists and the American separatists in 1776. That was the last time the United States had a foreign power ruling. The United States has been the foreign power, or at least it's been an influential foreign power. So the word liberty and freedom for someone in India is no longer ruled by the British. Or in Northern Ireland, it means home rule. They haven't gotten to the stage where they can talk about the luxuries that we can talk about, where individual free markets and all that. It's just the foreign ruler and the foreign influencer. So even if you're in a supposedly decolonized African nation, especially a former French one, you're still heavily ruled and influenced by the French government under the neo-colonialism that the French imposed. So that the term freedom and liberty is more about home rule. So that's the language is already different, for example. But the other thing I'll just say quickly as well, what I was going to say with that, is that talking about values and all that. So two heroes of mine, and no doubt yourself, like Angela Keaton and Scott Horton, right? They became very prominent over the massacre at Waco, Texas, the Branch Davidians in '95. So they became prominent in that. So that was a anti-cultist, an anti. These people are different to us. These Christians are an abomination to the Protestantism of America, to the accepted religion of America. And then there's always they're doing stuff to children, government rules because they're firearms are this millimeter long or whatever the minutiae of the law is, like what they did with the Ruby Ridge murders. So what happens is these individuals are made to seem different. They're made to seem absurd. They're not American conservative Christians. They're Waco, Texas religious freaks. So therefore, whatever happened to them is justified. That is how the populist mindset becomes down pat. So the liberty movement in the past was, no, just because they're different to me, they believe different things. That's where you had the Scott Hortons and the Angela Keatons. The culture war wasn't, I disagree or I agree with these people because of their faith and because they're living different to me at Waco, Texas. They're different. The problem is the entity, the monolith, the monopoly that's going after them, and that murdered families, that brutally murdered families. That's the problem. And the culture war, left and right, green and pink or whatever, all that sort of stuff, that is more concerned about David Koresh and his beliefs than it is the fact that he was wronged and they were wronged. And I think that's the problem. And it certainly, it's like, the family in Ruby Ridge, for example, that was murdered. He literally wanted to be left alone. They went out to be left alone. The government found them and used its own laws to create, the firearms charges to justify murdering his family and his dog. That's absurd. That is the issue. And the liberty movement used to champion those people, the people that are the indefensibles, you know what I mean? The man that likes dressing up as Sailor Moon and ejaculating everywhere onto a Stanley Pollock piece of work, you know what I mean? I don't want to do it. I don't want to see it. I don't want to agree. If he does that and he's calling that art and he's selling it online, that's great. That's who we should be defending. We should not be making friends with people that are talking about blowing up hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians as an abstract or as a historical perspective, simply because they're married with kids and they worship the same God as you. That to me is stupid, at least as far as a liberty philosophy goes. And that's my perspective, at least, you know what I mean? And I find I have more in common sometimes with migrants who are doing hard work and working for themselves here in Australia. Not all, but a good many. Lesbians, trans, gays, and feminists, real feminists, not this modern new age academic feminist. I have more in common with them in the flesh world, in the meat world, than I do with some people that are of my kind, my kin, if you will, who are just go to work, do your job, pay the mortgage, support the family, pay your taxes. I don't care what the government does as long as I have my picket fences, you know. I don't have anything in common with them because I don't live that life. I live outside that world. I try to live without hurting people and I try to live self-dependent, self-reliant. And I tend to find that I have more in common with the people in the Medusian Liberty piece and, you know, probably that artist that's doing the, you know, ejaculating on the art piece. You know, I have more in common with those people because they're different, because they're not hurting other people. I don't necessarily want to live their life or agree with them, but I don't want to also get married and have kids, at least not right now, just because my parents did it, who also got divorced, you know?
Yeah.
You know, like it's an absurdity. And I think it's a battlefield that doesn't need to be fought, a battle that doesn't need to be fought on a battlefield that doesn't even exist. And all that's happening is we're ignoring the monolith, we're ignoring the entity, and we're not talking about things that the monolith and the entity is doing. Like right now what's happening with Julian Assange, for example, Australians should be talking about that, but they're not. They're talking about who's going to give more pensions and who's going to cap interest rates and who's going to, because they all want this monolithic magical entity to do things for them. And they never ever once think, oh, wait a minute, they promised that last time and there's unintended consequences to it. And that goes for the liberty movement too. I think there's unintended consequences to trying to fight this liberty war, this culture war. I think there's unintended consequences to collectivizing everyone that's not a happily married man or woman. You know what I mean? And I think that's my bit on it all.
Yeah, I think your Ruby Ridge and Waco analogy, I think, is going to go a long way with people because I think that's a good point. But well, where can people find your work? I mean, do you just publish on the Institute or?
Yeah, I'm very lucky that pretty much everything I submit Scott accepts, and so I'm kind of lucky there. I don't put up my fighting and self-defense stuff and my fiction stuff at Half Cage. That's my website, halfcage.com. That has my Libertarian Institute stuff as well as my non-Libertarian Institute stuff. And my fiction stuff is on ebook if anyone wants to read fiction. I've got horror stories and anti-war stories about the civilian perspective. I even, just to be contrarian, wrote a erotic fiction novel stories because I thought it would be a bit taboo within the liberty movement at the moment. And also written 2 novels, working on my 3rd one. So yeah, they can be found online under my name.
Right on.
Interested.
Okay, yeah, well, go ahead, sorry.
I said thank you very much, Patrick. It was awesome to be on.
Yeah, it was great to finally get to meet you. Like I said, it's been, months and months. So, all right, well, all those links to your website and you have your other works are listed on your website, right?
Yeah, that's correct, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, those will be listed in the show notes page at libertyweekly.net/213. So.
All right, thank you very much for that.
All right. Well, thanks again, man.
All right. Thank you.